There's a soccer stadium called the Audi Field. For those who are Washington residents, you'll know that the Audi Field on the left-hand side here is renovated. It's about 250 meters in length. And I want you to imagine, this is where we are now. And that's the Audi Field over there. And I want you to imagine you're in the Audi Field soccer stadium. And you're standing at the very top seat, or sitting if you wish, at the top of the stadium. And you're looking down into the soccer field. And there's a magic drop of water. And that magic drop of water is magic because every 60 seconds, it doubles in size. So in the first minute, the drop is twice the size as it was. In the next minute, it's 4 times its original size, and so forth. I want you to think, from your position at the top of the stadium, I want you to think about how long you think it would take for the magic drop of water to drown you. Now, it's cheery, but what's interesting is I'll give you a clue. After 45 minutes, all you can see is just the grass of the soccer field covered in water. That's all. The stadium at that moment, at minute 45, is 7% full. So how long do you think it will take until the water goes above your head? And you're right at the top of the stadium. And the answer, believe it or not, is another 4 minutes. Now, you guys and girls understand exponential growth. But even when you understand the fact that today is the slowest pace of change we'll ever experience, and when we understand the fact that we are no longer in one-off change management, we're in the management of perpetual change, the majority of us will sit and watch at minute 45 just the grasping and think we're safe. Now, how long do you think it would take for the water to drown us in this building? Another 6 minutes. That's exponential growth. And we, my friends, are at minute 45. We have no conception of what the next 4 minutes will look like, and absolutely no comprehension of what the next 6 minutes will look like after that. What's amazing is that we don't have to be the biggest companies in the world to ride this out and turn it into opportunity. We don't need to have $1/3 trillion in the bank. We don't need to have the funkiest brands and the biggest retail presence. Because the good thing is that success isn't size dependent. It's response dependent. And then paradoxically, over time, what we tend to do is we tend to not respond increasingly. We get comfortable. So the irony of it all is that the people in most danger at the top of the soccer stadium are the people with the biggest wealth. On Raf's chart of those company valuations, how responsive to change do you feel those companies feel? How productively paranoid are Apple? You couldn't spend the amount of money that you've got in your bank, not without paying the tax you owe to the American government, but you could not actually get your head around spending that money. There is absolutely no appetite amongst the GAFAMs and anyone else actually of these sizes to do anything. And that's why what happens over the next 4 minutes, we're at minute 45, over the next 4 minutes, what happens is that the tables turn, and they turn fast, and they turn violently. Because success is not size dependent, it's response dependent. we have to do now, here at OXS 17, is choose our response at minute 45. That's it. There's a gap, as Viktor Frankl said, the Holocaust survivor. There's a gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap lies our growth and our freedom. Reacting is just reenacting what we did last time. Response is your liberty. You have total sovereignty of your response. There is nothing and no one who can tell you how to respond. You can choose. And when you're at the top of the soccer stadium, the standard responses would be, well, it's 93% empty at minute 45. So actually, my chosen response is to do nothing. You now are at minute 45. What you do for the next 4 minutes will not only determine your career, it will determine your children's way of life and their children's. We tend not to choose to respond. We tend to wait for the stadium to flood. We just watch the water happily across the grass at minute 45. And I can't find an industry vertical where the chart doesn't exist. Why on earth do we choose to do nothing? Sorry. See, the thing is, don't know how that one got in there. Slipped in. Resist. I can't, it's so hard. Anyway, sorry. With respect to the town we're in, the thing is that the causes of business failure, and I love this chart, from the brilliant entitled Association of Insolvency and Restructuring Advisors. How boring is their life? But what they've done is they've gone and looked at the last 30 years of business success and failures, and they've equated the fact that 52% of business failures are things that happen inside management control. They could have stopped it. They just chose not to. Half of all business failures. This is 3,000 companies from a two-person company through to multi-billion-dollar companies. 52%. 15% are external triggers that happened outside the company that went into the internal management structure and then nothing happened. So it's triggered outside and came inside. 24% is a mixture of both. 8% is the amount of failure that comes which you couldn't have done anything about. And then there's 1% of bad luck. The summary of this slide is that we can choose whether to succeed. Our response at 45 is actually the only deciding factor as to whether or not we win or lose in 9 out of 10 cases. It's not whether Facebook are going to eat our lunch. It's not whether WhatsApp have eroded our revenue. It's not whether the FCC regulations are going to, whether Ajit Pai is going to screw up our market through abolishing Article 2. It's actually down to whether or not you decide at minute 45 to build a boat. Good. You see, the thing is that success is a terrible, terrible, terrible teacher. And what I love is that Bill Gates quoted this just before Steve Ballmer became the least successful chief exec in history. But it's true that it seduces people to think that they can't lose. But my even more favoured quote is by the chief exec of Nokia on the Burning Platform speech, where he said, "We understood the problem, but at some deep level we couldn't accept what was happening. Many projects carried on. We examined the sales projections for the following quarter when our eyes should have been focused on much further ahead, like the next 4 minutes. The worst that can happen to a company is run out of money, to be forced into bankruptcy. Here's a punchline. Enormous success is perhaps the next worst." We can avoid reality as much as we like But Lord have mercy, we cannot avoid the consequences of avoiding reality. Amen. Now that should actually be the end of my keynote. I have nothing more to say, but let me say all of what I've just said in many different ways. Okay, so professional speaker's privilege. So, minute 45 is where we are. How can I reskin this? It's actually down to what we think, as I've mentioned, but as the Lao Tzu said, at the end of the day, it's enabling us to watch our thoughts, to choose our response, which actually determines our destiny. It's thousands of year old knowledge and wisdom. So I'm going to tell you a story, and I want you to think carefully about what message I'm sliding under the door here. This is an artist's representation of a guy called Ignaz Semmelweis on June the 1st, 1846 in Vienna. Now, for those physicians amongst us, if there are any in the room, Semmelweis was the least successful scientist because he was, unfortunately, the person that made a massive discovery and he had absolutely no understanding, really, of what to do with it. Now, what he was fascinated by at the maternity wing of the Vienna Children's Hospital was that the infant mortality rate was 10 times greater when doctors enabled women to give birth than it was when midwives enabled women to give birth. And he studied it, and he studied it. So he went to a lot of doctors' places and hospitals, and he noticed that doctors tended to deliver babies when women were on their sides, whereas midwives delivered babies when they're on their backs. So maybe Semmelweis thought, this is the reason. So he actually asked the doctors to change their positioning, and it had absolutely no effect. Damn it. So then he thought, well, actually what's happening is that there used to be, in one of the hospitals, there would be a priest that when a baby was born would go ding and ring a bell. And for some reason, the infant mortality was very, very high in that hospital, so Semmelweis thought, well, actually it's the shock of hearing a bell after you've given birth that shocks the woman, and that transfers some form of blood pressure anomaly with the child. And anyway, no, it turned out that stopping the priest ringing the bell wasn't the problem. Then, all of a sudden, Semmelweis realized that actually he was driving himself a bit mad, so he decided to go on holiday. And when he came back on holiday, he found that his best friend, sadly, had died. And what was weird was that his best friend in the hospital had died not from delivering a baby or being around this childbed fever, as it was called, but his best friend, the doctor, had done a post-mortem exam. And when he was doing a post-mortem exam, he got his finger pricked. And somehow he died from a finger prick by doing a post-mortem. But he died from the same conditions as the kids had died from. Childbed fever isn't actually exclusively for children. What? So what Semmelweis thought was what we need to do is we need to use chlorine to clean our hands. To clean our hands so that there can't be any disease interaction. And when he went to the doctors and said, you need to clean your hands before helping women give birth, because midwives did, the doctor said, a gentleman's hands are always clean. We don't need to clean our hands. And they laughed him out of town. He went so crazy, he ended up in a mental asylum where he eventually died of the childbed fever that he was researching. 20 years later, yeah, let's keep the heating system off. 20 years later, Louis Pasteur discovered this finding and then thought, I'm going to scale it out to the marketplace. And since the late 18th century to today, Louis Pasteur's inventions have saved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of lives. From pasteurization through to all manner of medicines. Louis Pasteur. Now, in this story, which person would you prefer to be? Semmelweis or Pasteur? Semmelweis, hands up. Pasteur, hands up. Sweet. Correct answer. Now, what's interesting? We don't need the other slide then. This one, the thing is that Louis Pasteur saw a mess. The mess was that Semmelweis couldn't scale his findings, and he was upsetting the doctors by saying that the gentleman had dirty hands. So what Louis Pasteur did is, looking at that mess, he decided to make these medicines something the doctors could sell. And boy, oh boy, the doctors became extraordinarily pleased with medicine, with medicines and hand cleaning products. Because Pasteur didn't insult the doctors. Pasteur saw the mess and fixed the mess. And whilst we were at it, because we were on quotes today, Pasteur also said, do not let yourself be tainted with barren skepticism. What a quote. And I would ask you to not let yourself be tainted with a barren skepticism. At minute 45, in a stadium with magic water. If you follow my metaphor. Good. As I look at the world it is, that's okay, so that story was another way of saying the same thing. I'm going to say it in a slightly different way now. Looking at the way the world is, all I see is enormous mess. All I see is how Pasteur looked at what Semmelweis had gone mad through finding, and I see mess that we can solve together. And I mean mess by either a dirty or an untidy state of things or a place, or a situation that is confused and full of problems. From this moment onwards, I want you to think carefully about what are the biggest messes that you know about in your industry, in related industries, in the world. Think about the messes that should have been solved by now but just aren't. I ran something called an unlock session with Miriam a couple of years ago. This time last year, and 2 years ago. And we did a mess finding exercise. We take people away for 3 days, open their brains, shake stuff in, put it back in, and then help them become multimillionaires. So we sat down with a lady who was one of our unlock session attendees, and we were talking about mess in the financial industry of loan origination mortgages. And we actually discovered that the problem was huge, based on fraud, legacy systems, increased customer dissatisfaction. The whole mortgage industry was just full of mess. Plus, the Australian authorities wanted everything to be digitized using something called PEXA, but no one could actually find out how to become PEXA-enabled. The whole thing was a mess. 35% of Australian banks' IT spend is committed to ongoing regulatory reporting and compliance. It was a regulatory nightmare. Mess found. So what we worked on was creating a solution to each of those messes. A piece of software that would solve all of them. And go to proactive, intuitive regulation management, working with the regulators. Not hard, right? These are the messes. These are the solutions. And we branded them under the company name of MoneyCatcher. And Miriam and I took a shareholding on the board. KPMG put a pre-invention valuation of 2 million. It's now much, much more. We patented something called HomeChain. We patented something called RegChain, which the regulators think is like gold dust for them. It's using a private permission-based blockchain. Straightforward mess finding, mess solving. And the industry value is enormous. It reduces 36-day average to get a mortgage process down to 5, maximum. And financially, it can save just the Australian business banking 1.17 billion per annum. And MoneyCatcher is on track to take in 20% of that market, of 666,000 loans. It's about 120,000 loans, retails for MoneyCatcher at $600 a piece at a 43% net profit. On an EBITDA multiple, it puts MoneyCatcher at the same size as some of those companies that we've just seen. That, my friends, is mess finding. Where there is a mess, there's a market. All we have to do is work out the mess from the top of the stadium, which is tough because what we tend to think is the mess is going to happen in 10 years or 20 years. We need to think of the mess there and then. If in the next 10 years there is 8.5 billion people, if 17% of them are age 65, by the way, half the people that have ever lived to 65 are still alive today in the history of humanity, just a point of fact. 500 billion connected devices. Let's say there's an increase over the next 10 years of energy demand by 50% and water by 40% and food demand by 35%. Bearing in mind there's more access to mobile phones than fresh running water in the world right now. This is what the world actually looks like, and it is an enormous mess. And I think, and here's the punchline, that the solutions are going to be based on the thing that you are actually in the industry of doing, which is access. You are now, from this moment onwards, not in the technology world. You're in the world solution industry. It's all the same now. The technology, arguably the networks are our bloodstream. The hardware is our cells. The software is our DNA. We're living in a world where our children now expect everything immediately and bypass actual understanding for instant gratification, speaking in 3-letter synonyms, acronyms, with a huge distrust of the government and the politicians and the companies, liking something on Facebook instead of giving to charity, slacktivism, comfortable in the knowledge that everything is 2 taps away. I showed my kids some old Nokia phones. They have the same reaction to Facebook now. That's their reaction to Nokia phones last year. Now, that's their reaction when I ask them whether or not they're going to use Facebook. They laugh until they cry. Why on earth would they use something that their dad would use? We're at minute 45, people. And Facebook don't have a boat. It's not size dependent, it's response dependent. Now, we, in the game of access solutions, have things to consider. The computers that we usually would build networks with is most certainly our DNA and our cell systems and our bloodstreams. We are definitely in a situation of looking down towards gene hacking as an absolute reality. CRISPR's announcement yesterday that they're actually able to put in a power tool, a micro nano computer power tool, into cancerous cells and beat it. But the question is, on what networks are they running? How are the power tools communicating with the power tools of our body anyway? These are all messes that need to be fixed. IBM say that the biggest problem in artificial intelligence, in healthcare, let's say, is data. If only there was a company that understood how data management worked. the whole of the world of smart dust nanocomputing, being able to drink a bottle of water and have 10,000 cameras inside you, is now real. How are those cameras going to communicate to each other, and how are the cameras going to communicate to the users? On what networks? On what communication principles? This is you. Biohacking. People putting things under their skin. What messes do you think are apparent here? What quality control issues are we looking at? Who's going to run the networks? Who's going to set the communication principles? Who's going to help the regulators? That at the moment, yesterday, Miriam and I were at Capitol Hill, and Ajit Pai, the chairman of the FCC, was inside there speaking to both parties about removing Article 2 and how net neutrality will actually enable innovation. Now, Ajit used to be at Verizon, head legal counsel, and then was in the government before and after that. But he's the only person in Capitol Hill who actually understands at least a tiny bit of what the future actually looks like. None of this stuff, nothing that I've showed you, has even touched the radar of regulators. No. When you build your boat at minute 45 for the rest of the day, you're going to have to build the boat with an instruction manual for the regulators. You're certainly not having to wait until the outcome of FCC's rulings happens, because they haven't got a bloody clue what to do. No one does. Not only is the only way, the best way to create the future is to predict the future is to create it, we haven't actually got an option. We're actually in that game. And by the way, I haven't even touched on what will happen down the line in terms of biocrime. I am going to show you now, just on the lead up to our break, something called the Mess Management Matrix. It's a toolkit of how to spot and address mess. Because where there's a mess, there's a market. 4 points, just 4. By the way, I see some people taking pictures. You might want to download this deck. It's free of charge. Ta-da! 10.io/OXS17. It's free of charge as a PDF. You can download this from that link, and you can use and abuse the content as your own thinking, if you like. Doesn't matter. All I'm basically doing is paraphrasing Plato and Socrates anyway. Each week I read kind of 1,000 articles a day pretty much, and I'm absolutely and utterly an information junkie. And so each Friday or Thursday night, I send out something called Pulse across all 12 industry verticals of what I think I've noticed that maybe other people haven't, and an angle of what to do about it. Telecommunications Pulse, for instance, might be one that you want to sign up. It's totally and utterly free of charge. 10.io/Pulse. Anywho, this is the perfect timing, sir. The Mess Management Matrix. The first Mess Management Matrix point is to start with the most obvious mess. There's a light bulb just gone on. Thank you for whoever is doing the sound effects on cue. So, start with the most obvious messes. Now, you know, in your industries, you know what the most obvious messes are. You know what needs to be fixed. You do. And in every industry, the companies inside it absolutely know the messes themselves. Globally, the lack of drinking water is actually the mess, next to the fact that people don't die quick enough. So that's actually the mess. But going down a level somewhat, there are other messes that, for instance, everyone who's built an IKEA piece of furniture, like a bookshelf, will understand that's a massive mess, which is why the chief executive of IKEA Sweden turned the whole system of building IKEA furniture on its head, actually deleted their range of furniture and created the snap-together furniture range. Our children will never know the delight that we had with the Allen key. What's that piece then? The whole thing's in place. The what's that peep? Yeah. So they will never know that feeling. So what messes are there in your industries? Is it maybe something to do with trust? Maybe something to do with loyalty? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe we should just kind of be honest and think, how can we actually really properly fix this stuff? Maybe there's things that are coming down the line that we pretty much know. When Trump appointed Ajit to be the FCC chairman, that is not an accident. It is obvious. What are we going to do? Not in a bad way, not in a good way. It's just really bloody obvious what Ajit Pai is going to do next. The FCC rulings are absolutely guaranteed to go in one particular direction. What are you going to do about the outcome? Because you actually know the outcome already. What do we do? What boat can we build when I tell you that there's 4 minutes left? That would be the Pentagon helicopters coming to get me. So, I would also like you to consider the second point of the mess management matrix. And the second point of the mess management matrix, I'm going to explain through the eyes of one particular carrier you may have heard of. It was a wonderful piece of news last month when Vodafone said that they were scrapping roaming data across Europe. It was a fantastic moment in time. And then a few days later, we realized that actually we had to upgrade to qualify. And then a few days after that, it turned out that the entire base contract prices go up to the same amount as the roaming charges are being reduced by. The second point of the mess management matrix, comrades, is don't create more mess. No. No fair. This won't work. It will fail hard, and they deserve it. But don't create more mess. First, start with the most obvious mess. 2, don't create more mess. These are the guiding principles, like Asimov's laws of robotics. Here's my laws of mess. Good. The reality is that yes, of course, if a Chinese factory can replace 90% of human workers by robots and increase the production by 250% and the defects drop by 80%, it would seem that the mess of human involvement has been solved. Unless, whilst we're doing it, we're also creating a world that actually wouldn't have humans in it. I've had worse dates than this. The thing is that we have a situation that looks fun and friendly on the outside until it kind of goes wrong. We have to think very carefully about that. Number 3 in my mess management matrix is how we can use the things that we've actually got to suit the mess in the most perfect way. Yes, it's fascinating to think about the drones that go overhead, but bearing in mind that 93% of the world's pain is in areas that no one can actually get the pain relief to, why don't you create a drone that's biodegradable that can fly and drop medicine and disintegrate? Why did it have to take these guys at MIT to create something that any of us could have created? How do these drones communicate? On what networks? How can we actually think about using the standard technology we got flipped? Why is it only now that solar panel cement is like, oh, of course. Why is it only now that, of course, we can use drones to light the way on your walk home? These are obvious messes. All of these messes are really obvious. The amount of crime in rural India is so high, not because there's so many people committing crimes, it's because actually most crimes go undetected because there's not enough police. But there is a lot of people with camera phones. So if you enable the camera phone people armed with weapons of mass communication to be reporters, micro-journalists, the crime rate goes down. Why didn't one of you think of that? We know the problems exist. We know the problems exist. And finally, in my mess management matrix, I would like you to, after we've thought about the fact that we start with the most obvious mess, secondly, we don't create more mess, thirdly, we modify the technologies that we've already got to suit the mess in the most relevant way. What we then have to do, my friends, is simplify the hell out of it. And on the OX website, as an example, on the demo section, the security and parent controls, behind that is an absolute quagmire of algorithmic complexity. And the trick is to simplify it. And we have all been somewhat guilty in the past of making things so complicated for people that they just don't understand. And you always see a company who gets it wrong, a B2C company, when they say, hey, look and buy this Sony AX561 4.H. So there's no one outside of your company that understands or even cares what that means. You see, the thing is, when people go into a DIY store, they're not going in to buy a drill. They're buying the 1/4-inch hole. Do you get it? We want the solution. We don't want the thing in between. We're in the business of closing the gap between what people have and what people need. We're in the access business, and there's never been a better time to be in it, just in case you didn't take a picture last time. In closing, I would like you to experiment with cost-benefit analysis and think whether anything that happens for the rest of the day and tomorrow, whether or not there'd be any benefit in it. Benefit for you and others. And whether or not the benefit actually outweighs the cost of changing. And I would say, as importantly, the cost of not changing. I will continually ask you this question for the next 24 hours as to whether or not you actually feel that there's actually more benefit to do it than not, or whether or not the cost of not changing is high. And in fact, that cost of not changing is something that a lot of people think, well, actually, we don't even know what to do, so actually we'd be better to not do anything. But I would say that if you're at the top of the stadium at minute 45, the first thing we need to do is actually speculate of what potentially could happen, and then maybe kind of like explore some scenarios and think, oh, hold on a minute, the stadium is this high and the water's doubling each time, and if we put it into a spreadsheet, then within 32 seconds we can find out that we're going to be drowned in 4 minutes. It's not complicated stuff, my friends. But then once we've actually got the scenarios and the projections, we can move towards predictions, and then we can move towards facts. And above all else, I would like you to replace the term ROI in your head to stand not only for return on investment, but also for risk of inaction. We're at minute 45 and President 45. The two are not necessarily linked. Anyway, we are at minute 45. It's minute 45. God, Jesus. Minute 45. And therefore, you have these four, in summary, of mess management matrix. 1, start with the obvious. 2, don't create more. 3, use the stuff that we've actually already got and just adapt it for the mess. And 4, keep it simple, stupid. Is everyone really clear on this? In that case, I'll stop. Thank you very much.